The jet had been missing for 18 years, but Ethan's German Shepherd wasn't searching the wreck. He was digging beneath a fallen cedar. Bruno's claws tore through wet earth until they struck metal with a hollow clang. Ethan dropped beside him, rain dripping from his sleeve as a sealed case emerged beneath the roots. Then Bruno suddenly stopped digging, turned toward the dark timber, and went completely still. Something else was out there. What do you think Bruno sensed? The first sound Ethan Cole heard was air brakes. A long metallic hiss tore through the darkness outside his truck, and before his eyes were fully open, his right hand had already moved. It reached beneath the folded jacket beside him. Found nothing. For 2 seconds, Ethan didn't know where he was. Not Idaho. Not the gravel pullout beside Highway 93. Somewhere hotter. Dust hanging in the air. Rotor blades beating overhead. A voice shouting through a headset while a warning tone screamed from an instrument panel. Then a German Shepherd shifted behind the passenger seat. Ethan blinked. The windshield was silver with frost. A semi rolled past on the highway, red taillights shrinking into the darkness. No rotor wash, no dust, no radio traffic, just an 18-wheeler heading north before dawn. Ethan slowly lowered his hand. Wrong country, buddy. Bruno climbed forward without making a sound. At 7 years old, the German Shepherd had learned that some moments didn't need excitement. He didn't paw at Ethan or lick his face, he simply stood between the seats and pressed one solid shoulder against Ethan's knee. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. I'm good. Bruno stayed exactly where he was. That's an order. One ear moved. Ethan almost smiled. Yeah, that's what I thought. He checked the dashboard clock. 4:41 a.m. He had slept perhaps 2 hours. That made it a decent night. Ethan pulled on the boots he'd placed beside the driver's seat. He always kept them there. Toes pointed toward the door. His truck keys were in the right pocket of his jeans. Wallet in the left. Flashlight clipped beside the emergency brake. He hadn't planned any of that in years. His hands simply kept doing it. The truck was an old Ford with rust spreading over both rear wheel wells and enough miles on the engine to make every cold start a negotiation. Behind the seats were nearly all of Ethan's possessions. 2 changes of clothes, a sleeping bag, a battered toolbox, Bruno's food, a camp stove, an army duffel, and a cardboard box Ethan hadn't opened since his divorce. He turned the key. The starter groaned. Come on, another groan. Bruno watched the dashboard. Don't judge me. On the 3rd attempt, the engine coughed alive. Warm air eventually crawled through the vents. Ethan poured yesterday's coffee from a thermos and drank it cold. For the past 8 months, this had been home. Not because he had planned some grand escape into the American West. There was nothing romantic about washing in gas station bathrooms or calculating whether 5 gallons of fuel mattered more than a hot meal. Work had simply disappeared faster than bills did. The repair shop in Twin Falls had cut staff. His landlord raised the rent. The divorce had already eaten through most of what he'd saved. 1 bad month became 3, then 6. Ethan discovered how quickly an address could become something you used to have. But he could still fix things. Generators, tractors, snowmobiles, old diesel pumps that younger mechanics sometimes wanted to replace instead of understand. That kept him and Bruno moving. A rancher outside Chalice had paid him $200 to resurrect a tractor everyone else had declared dead. A logging crew near Salmon gave him 4 days' work repairing hydraulic lines. An elderly couple paid him in cash, canned peaches, and venison after he fixed their generator before a cold snap. Ethan took what came. Yesterday, what came was a phone call from Sheriff Wade Turner. Turner wasn't really a friend. Ethan wasn't sure he had many of those anymore. But the sheriff knew Ethan could repair machinery without needing a manual held open in front of him. A backup generator at an isolated fire lookout in the Salmon River Mountains had failed its final seasonal test. A maintenance contractor had canceled. The lookout needed to be winterized before the first serious storm arrived. 3 days' work, cash, enough to fill the truck, restock Bruno's food, and maybe rent a motel room for a few nights. A shower with actual hot water had become a luxury Ethan thought about more often than he cared to admit. He scratched behind Bruno's ear. 3 days. Bruno looked at him. Generator behaves, we get paid. The dog's brown eyes remained skeptical. And if we're lucky, I might even smell like a human being again. That earned him a slow wag. By sunrise, they were heading east. The highway narrowed as the mountains rose around them. Frost whitened the fields. Weathered barns sat beneath enormous skies, and cattle gathered around steaming water troughs. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel. Bruno occupied the passenger seat now, watching the landscape pass. There were moments when Ethan envied him. Bruno never seemed embarrassed by yesterday, never rehearsed old conversations, never woke at 4:41 wondering what decision made 10 years earlier might have changed if he'd waited 30 seconds longer. He simply watched what was in front of him. Ethan was trying to learn that. They stopped in a small town for fuel. Ethan bought coffee, 2 breakfast sandwiches, and a gallon jug of water. He ate one sandwich leaning against the truck and saved the other for later. Bruno received his measured breakfast from a plastic container. A pickup backfired near the pumps. Ethan's shoulders snapped tight. Coffee splashed over his knuckles. His eyes had already found the source before anyone else at the station looked up. Old blue Chevrolet. Teenager behind the wheel. Bad exhaust. Nothing else. Ethan wiped his hand against his jeans. A woman filling her SUV glanced at him. He looked away before she could decide whether to ask if he was all right. Bruno finished eating and sat beside him. I'm getting predictable. Bruno sneezed. Keep your opinions to yourself. They left town. By late morning, pavement became gravel. Then gravel became an old Forest Service road, twisting upward through lodgepole pine and granite. Cell service vanished. Ethan didn't mind. He preferred maps anyway. A paper topographic map lay folded on the passenger seat. The lookout circled in pencil. He had downloaded the coordinates too, but batteries died and screens broke. Paper usually failed more honestly. The elevation climbed. Patches of old snow survived in shaded cuts. Clouds were gathering beyond the western ridges, thin and gray for now. The forecast gave him perhaps 4 days before the weather turned. Plenty of time, if the generator cooperated. The road narrowed around a steep drainage. Ethan rounded a bend and hit the brakes. Bruno braced against the dashboard. Well. 30 yards ahead, half the road was gone. Spring runoff or a recent slide had torn through the slope, leaving a muddy gash where the road should have crossed. Rocks and broken timber filled the drainage below. Ethan killed the engine and stepped outside. The silence came down immediately. No highway, no town, only wind moving high through the pines. He walked toward the washout and crouched near the edge. The remaining soil was undercut. Tire tracks ended several yards behind it, suggesting somebody else had already decided not to gamble. Ethan studied the opposite side. The lookout was less than 5 miles away by his map. He looked at the ford, then at Bruno. No. Bruno tilted his head. I'm not losing my transmission for 3 days' pay. Ethan backed the truck into a concealed turnout, well away from the unstable edge. He packed water, food, first aid supplies, rain gear, tools, headlamp, spare batteries, map, compass, and enough insulation to survive an unexpected night outside. Old habits. Plan for the job, pack for the failure. He checked Bruno's paws, adjusted the dog's harness, and clipped on a lead for the first section. At 11:26, they started walking. The first mile was easy. Cold sunlight filtered through the forest. Somewhere downhill, water moved over stone. Bruno walked slightly ahead, nose occasionally dropping toward tracks in the mud. Deer, probably elk, nothing unusual. Ethan found himself breathing easier. This was why he accepted jobs in places like this. Machines made sense. Mountains made even more sense. Neither asked him how he was doing and expected a lie. They climbed toward an exposed ridge. Ethan stopped automatically before crossing the skyline. The behavior made him shake his head. There was nobody watching. Still, he approached from below and crossed where a cluster of granite offered partial cover. Bruno suddenly slowed. Ethan noticed through the leash before he saw it. The dog's head lifted, nose high. He drew in the air. Once, twice. Then Bruno turned toward the west. The lookout was northeast, not our direction. Bruno remained still. Ethan waited. After several seconds, the dog continued walking. They covered another 100 yards. Bruno stopped again. Same direction. Same raised nose. This time his ears moved forward. Ethan looked into the trees. Nothing but descending forest and a ravine hidden below the ridge. Deer? Bruno didn't react to the word. Ethan checked the map. No trail, no cabin, no marked road, nothing. Come on. Bruno followed. Another quarter-mile passed. Then the wind changed. Bruno stopped for the third time. He didn't sniff casually now. His entire body became still, head forward, mouth closed, weight balanced beneath him. Ethan knew enough about Bruno to understand the difference. Something had changed. The easy feeling he'd carried up the mountain disappeared. He shortened the lead without pulling it and studied the timber below. Sunlight moved across the trees. For an instant, something far down in the ravine flashed. Not water. Too sharp. Too bright. Metal. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Bruno took one step toward it. Then another. Bruno. The German shepherd stopped, but he didn't look back. The fire lookout stood somewhere beyond the ridge behind them. The job was that way. The money was that way. The sensible choice was that way. Bruno stared into the ravine. Then he lifted his nose into the cold mountain wind once more. And Ethan realized his dog wasn't curious. He was working. Ethan let the leash go slack. Bruno stood at the edge of the ridge, nose lifted into the wind. His ears pointed toward the ravine, and every loose line in his body had disappeared. Show me. Bruno started downhill. Not quickly. That caught Ethan's attention more than anything. When Bruno followed deer scent, there was energy in him. His nose stayed low, tail moving, paws eager to solve whatever story an animal had written across the ground. This was different. He moved 10 feet, stopped, tested the air, then moved again. Ethan followed. The slope steepened almost immediately. Pine needles slid beneath his boots, and loose granite clicked away into the trees below. He checked the map once more. Nothing was marked in the drainage. No road, no structure, no reason to be down there. Easy. Bruno slowed. Ethan moved sideways across the slope rather than straight down, choosing patches of exposed stone and roots that would hold his weight. He had spent enough time around mountains to know gravity punished impatience. The forest thickened. Within minutes, the road above vanished. The temperature dropped beneath the trees, and patches of old snow appeared between boulders where sunlight rarely reached. Bruno stopped again. This time he sat, straight-backed, motionless. Ethan froze. The dog's eyes were fixed somewhere below them. Bruno? Nothing. Ethan felt the small hairs rise along the back of his neck. He stepped behind a granite outcrop instead of remaining exposed. It wasn't a decision he thought about. Cover first. Observe. Listen. The old sequence still lived in his muscles. He crouched and studied the drainage. Near ground. Mid-distance. High ground. Nothing moved. He listened. Wind through pine needles. Water somewhere far below. A raven. Then silence. No voices. No engines. No obvious threat. Ethan looked at Bruno. The German shepherd hadn't moved. Stay. Bruno remained seated. Ethan edged around the granite and studied the slope through a gap in the trees. There. The flash appeared again. A hard white spark between two trunks. Sunlight striking something reflective. The brightness punched through Ethan before he could prepare for it. For half a second, Idaho disappeared. Heat. Dust. Rotor wash flattening brown grass. A helicopter sitting crooked beside an Afghan landing zone while sunlight burned across a shattered windshield. Someone shouting. Clear! Ethan's hand locked around his trekking pole. His chest stopped halfway through a breath. Then Bruno's collar gave a quiet, metallic click. Idaho returned. Cold air. Pine. Granite. Ethan looked down. His knuckles had gone white around the pole. He opened his fingers one at a time. Not there. Bruno glanced at him. Ethan swallowed. I'm here. The words were meant for himself. Bruno stood. They continued. The farther they descended, the stranger the terrain became. Trees grew at odd angles from the slope. Several had been snapped years ago and healed around the damage. Moss-covered rocks in thick green blankets. Then Ethan noticed something that wasn't rock. A curved strip of dull metal protruded from beneath the moss. He raised one hand. Bruno stopped immediately. Ethan approached alone. He crouched and pulled away wet leaves. Aluminum. Thin. Paint clung to one edge beneath years of oxidation. White with a narrow blue stripe. He turned the fragment over. Rows of rivet holes ran along one side. Aircraft skin. Ethan stared at it. Well, I'll be damned. Bruno sniffed the edge, then immediately turned downhill again. Ethan didn't follow yet. He looked upward. A piece this size could have come from almost anything. Small plane. Helicopter. Old wreckage hauled up here decades ago and dumped. Except nobody hauled aircraft debris into a ravine without a road. He photographed the fragment with his phone and slipped it back exactly where he'd found it. Bruno. The dog was already waiting 20 feet below. Ethan followed. They found the next piece less than 50 yards away. Larger, partially buried. Ethan brushed soil away and exposed a section of tubing and torn metal. Then he saw a manufacturer plate. Most of the lettering had been scarred by impact and weather, but the construction was enough. Aviation. No question now. Ethan sat back on his heels. He looked through the forest. Debris didn't scatter uphill after a crash. If these pieces had separated during impact, the main wreckage would likely be below. Bruno suddenly moved left. Hold. The dog stopped. Ethan studied the ground before following. A depression ran through the forest beneath years of needles and brush. Not a trail. A scar. Several trees along it were younger than the surrounding timber. Ethan looked uphill along the same line, then downhill. His stomach tightened. Something large had passed through here a long time ago. Fast, violently. The forest had spent years covering the evidence. He unclipped Bruno's leash from the harness, but left the short traffic lead attached. Close. Bruno moved beside his left knee. They descended together. Ethan's attention changed now. He stopped seeing a beautiful mountain and started seeing problems. Loose slope, deadfall, blind pockets between boulders, possible unstable wreckage, weather moving in from the west. He checked the time. 12:38. They had already drifted far from the original route. The responsible decision was obvious. Mark the location. Return to the road. Get to the lookout. Call Sheriff Turner. Ethan stopped. We're done. He turned uphill. Bruno didn't follow. Ethan took 3 steps before noticing. Bruno. The German shepherd stood looking down the drainage. Come. Bruno looked at Ethan, then downhill. Don't start. Bruno remained where he was. Ethan stared at him. Bruno had excellent recall. Not perfect, no dog was, but good enough that refusing a direct command meant something had overridden routine. Ethan returned to him. What is it? Bruno moved. 20 yards farther down, he stopped beside another piece of wreckage. This one was unmistakable. A wheel assembly. The tire had collapsed long ago, but part of the strut remained attached. Ethan crouched beside it. He knew landing gear. He'd spent years with aircraft systems, years diagnosing failures by sound, vibration, smell, and the marks metal left when something went wrong. This wasn't from a bush plane. Too heavy, too complex. He scraped mud from a component and studied the geometry. Business jet. The words sounded strange in the empty forest. Bruno's head lifted. A breeze moved uphill. The dog inhaled deeply. Then his posture changed again. He moved downhill with more purpose. Ethan followed until the trees opened around a rocky shelf. Below them, the ravine dropped sharply into a bowl of granite and lodgepole pine. Ethan stopped at the edge. For several seconds, his mind refused to make sense of what his eyes were seeing. Something pale stretched between the trees. Long, straight, wrong. Then the wind moved the branches aside. A tail section appeared. Faded white paint. A blue stripe. Part of an aircraft registration barely visible beneath lichen. The vertical stabilizer leaned against the forest at an unnatural angle, while the broken body of a jet disappeared farther down the slope, beneath trees and shadow. Young pines had grown around it. One had pushed through torn aluminum. The mountain hadn't merely hidden the aircraft. It had begun absorbing it. Ethan stood completely still. Bruno moved to the edge of the shelf and stared down. Stay back. The dog obeyed. Ethan removed his phone. No service. He tried the emergency call anyway. Nothing. He checked his GPS position, wrote it on the margin of the paper map, then looked at the western sky. Clouds were thickening. He should leave. Everything in him understood that. A wreck this old wasn't going anywhere. The sheriff could organize a proper team. Search and rescue could approach with equipment. There could be unstable fuel residues, sharp metal, collapsed sections, human remains. This wasn't his responsibility. Then Bruno made a quiet sound. Not a bark. A low breath through his nose. Ethan looked at him. The dog's attention wasn't on the tail. It was fixed farther down, where the broken fuselage disappeared behind a stand of dark timber. Ethan followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then sunlight shifted across the wreck. An opening became visible in the side of the aircraft. Not a jagged impact tear. A door. Open. Ethan's expression changed. He had seen wrecks. Doors didn't bother him. But this one did. Because from where he stood, the emergency exit didn't look as if the mountain had ripped it away. It looked as if someone had opened it. From the inside. Ethan folded the map and slid it into his jacket. 5 minutes, he said. Bruno looked at him. We look. We don't touch anything we don't have to. Then we get high enough to make radio contact. The German shepherd stepped forward. Ethan caught his harness. Behind me. This time Bruno obeyed. Ethan chose a path down toward the lost jet, and with every step, the mountain seemed to grow quieter. The last 100 yards took nearly 20 minutes. Ethan refused to approach straight downhill. The slope was too loose and the aircraft had come to rest across broken granite that could shift without warning. He moved laterally instead, testing each patch of ground before committing his weight. Bruno stayed behind his left leg. Easy. A pine branch scraped Ethan's jacket. The jet slowly revealed itself. Its tail had survived better than the rest. Faded paint showed beneath moss and lichen, while the fuselage had broken across a shelf of rock farther below. One wing was gone. The other had folded backward and disappeared beneath fallen timber. Ethan stopped behind a boulder. He didn't move for almost a minute. Observe first. He traced the wreck from tail to nose. Approach route. Possible hazards. Escape route. Ground stability. Nothing moved except branches. No fresh tracks, he murmured. Bruno tested the wind. Ethan looked at the dog. Anything? Bruno's ears shifted, but his body stayed loose. Good enough. They advanced. Up close, the age of the wreck became clearer. Pine needles filled cracks in the fuselage. Moss grew across the wing root. A young lodgepole had risen through a torn section near the tail and was now thick enough that Ethan couldn't wrap both hands around its trunk. Whatever had happened here had happened years ago, maybe decades. Ethan reached the open emergency exit. He crouched without touching it. The hinges were still attached. The locking mechanism was damaged by corrosion, but the door itself had not been torn away by impact. He leaned closer. A mechanical handle sat in the open position. Ethan's jaw tightened. Someone could have moved it after the crash. Weather couldn't. He took photographs. Somebody got out. Bruno sniffed along the edge. Don't go in yet. Ethan removed his pack and left it where he could reach it quickly. He put on leather work gloves, tightened his jacket, and studied the floor inside. The aircraft rested at an angle. Loose debris could shift under weight. Torn aluminum edges weighted everywhere. He placed one boot inside, tested, then the other. The cabin smelled of damp fabric, oxidized metal, earth, and something faintly chemical that had long ago lost its strength. Sunlight entered through holes in the fuselage. Rows of passenger seats leaned at different angles. Most had deteriorated badly. But Ethan wasn't looking at upholstery. He was looking at what the crash had done, and what it hadn't. Bruno stepped inside after him. Close. The German shepherd stayed beside him. Ethan moved toward the rear seats. One restraint hung loose. He lifted the belt carefully. The webbing hadn't snapped. It had been cut. He found another farther forward. Same thing. A clean separation made years ago by a blade. Ethan lowered it. 2. Bruno sniffed the floor. Ethan continued. Near the cabin wall sat several food cans. At first they looked like ordinary debris. Then Ethan noticed their position. They were stacked, not thrown together. Stacked. 3 against the wall, 2 above them. He crouched. The labels had mostly disappeared, but one can still showed part of a faded soup logo. Beside them was a dark stain on the floor. Not blood. Soot. Ethan looked upward. The ceiling above it was blackened. Someone had made a small fire inside the wreck. His eyes moved back to the cans. Not hours after impact. Longer. Somebody had survived here. Maybe more than one person. Bruno pushed his nose beneath a seat. Leave it. The dog backed away. Ethan checked another row. No remains. No bones. No clothing containing anything human. He didn't know whether that made him feel better or worse. A sound exploded behind him. Bang! Ethan was on the floor before he knew he'd moved. Shoulder against a seat frame. Head down. One arm covering his neck. His other hand had reached toward his waist. Again. Nothing there. His heart slammed against his ribs. For one violent instant, cold Idaho air became heat. A helicopter door vibrating under rotor wash, dust filling his mouth, red warning light. A voice through a headset. "Clear! Clear!" Then Bruno hit him. Not hard. The shepherd pressed his body against Ethan's shoulder, blocking part of his view. Ethan blinked. The jet returned. A loose aluminum panel swung outside in the wind. Bang! He flinched again, smaller this time. Bruno didn't move. Ethan stared at the dog's fur inches from his face. Black saddle, tan shoulder, a tiny burr caught near the harness. Something real. Something now. He inhaled through his nose. Cold metal. Wet earth. Pine. Not hydraulic fluid. Not dust. Not Afghanistan. Okay. His voice sounded rough. Bruno turned his head. I'm okay. The dog remained pressed against him. Ethan sat up slowly. He looked at the panel. Just metal. Another gust moved it. This time Ethan watched it strike. Bang! His jaw tightened, but he stayed where he was. See? Bruno's expression suggested the explanation had been unnecessary. Ethan rubbed the dog's chest once. Don't get smug. He stood. His knees felt weaker than he wanted them to. He hated that part most. Not the memories. The betrayal of his own body afterward. He forced his attention back to the aircraft. Work the problem in front of you. That had saved him before. He moved toward the cockpit. The forward fuselage was crushed against granite, making access difficult. Through a torn section, Ethan could see the instrument panel folded inward. No pilot remains were visible from where he stood. He did not climb farther. Too unstable. He backed out. Outside, the wind had strengthened. Clouds now covered part of the western ridge. Ethan checked the time. 1:27. 5 minutes had become almost an hour. That's enough. Bruno had already left the opening. Ethan followed him around the fuselage. The dog moved toward the tail, nose low now. He crossed the debris field, then continued past it. Bruno. The dog kept moving. Ethan watched him enter the trees. Hey. Bruno stopped, looked back, then lowered his nose and moved again. Ethan frowned. The aircraft was behind them. Whatever Bruno was following wasn't inside it. He picked up his pack. 2 minutes. Bruno disappeared between the pines. Ethan followed. The forest beyond the wreck looked untouched at first. Then he noticed a shallow depression beneath the needles. He crouched. Not an animal trail. Too wide. Something had repeatedly passed this way. People, perhaps. Years ago. Bruno followed it. 20 yards. 30. The dog suddenly stopped beside a massive cedar that had fallen across the slope. Its roots had ripped a wall of earth from the mountain. Bruno circled the root ball, sniffed, returned to one spot, then began digging. Bruno. Dirt flew between his hind legs. Easy. The shepherd ignored him. Ethan moved closer. Bruno dug harder, claws tearing through damp soil and old pine needles. Ethan's first thought came unwanted. Human remains. His stomach tightened. Back. This time Bruno obeyed. Ethan crouched and examined the disturbed earth. Nothing visible. He took the folding and trenching shovel from his pack. It was old, scratched, heavier than modern camping gear, but he trusted it. He pushed the blade carefully into the ground. Loose soil, roots. Another few inches. Nothing. He changed angle. The shovel descended. Clang. Ethan stopped. Bruno's ears snapped forward. Metal. Not stone. Ethan scraped away soil with the edge of the shovel. A flat gray surface appeared beneath the roots. Manufactured. He cleared another section. A corner emerged. Then a handle. This hadn't fallen from the aircraft. It had been placed here. Buried. Ethan looked back toward the wreck, barely visible through the trees. Someone had survived that crash. Someone had walked away from it, and before they disappeared into these mountains, they had taken the time to hide something underground. Bruno stared at the exposed metal. Ethan slowly reached for the handle. The handle didn't move. Ethan cleared more dirt from around the object, working carefully with the shovel until he exposed a rectangular case about 2 feet long. Gray metal showed beneath patches of rust, and a rubber seal ran around the lid. It was too intact to have spent 18 years in open weather. Someone had chosen this place well. The fallen cedar had protected the ground from rain and snow. Stones had been packed around the case before soil was pushed over it. Even the handle had been folded flat. This wasn't crash debris. It was a cache. Ethan sat back on his heels. Bruno sniffed once along the edge. Back. The shepherd stepped away. Ethan studied the case before touching the latches. No wires. No unusual attachments. Nothing suggesting it was anything except what it appeared to be. Still, old habits made him examine it twice. Somebody wanted this found later. He lifted the first latch. It released with a dull snap. The second resisted until he worked it gently with his multi-tool. The lid opened. A stale medicinal smell escaped. Inside were emergency supplies, bandages in deteriorated wrappers, water purification tablets. A small flashlight corroded around the battery compartment. Several flare cartridges, a folding knife, 2 empty packets of pain medication. Ethan frowned. Not treasure. Not contraband. Survival gear. He lifted a plastic pouch from one corner. Inside was a woman's wallet. The leather had cracked, but the plastic liner had preserved the contents surprisingly well. A driver's license showed a woman in her late 30s with short brown hair. Rebecca Lane. Ethan read the name twice. It meant something. He couldn't place it. Beneath the wallet was a photograph. 4 people stood beside a white business jet on an airport ramp. The same blue stripe ran along its fuselage. A pilot stood nearest the nose, sunglasses pushed onto his head. Beside him was Rebecca Lane. A heavy-set man in an expensive coat stood slightly apart from the others. The 4th person was older, lean, smiling beneath a canvas hat. Ethan turned the photograph over. 4 names had been written in faded ink. Peter Collins, Rebecca Lane, Nathan Shaw, Dr. Samuel Hayes. Ethan stared at the last one. Oh, hell. He remembered now. Not the details, just the name. Years ago, long before Ethan had started living out of his truck, he'd heard people in Idaho talk about a physician who vanished somewhere in the mountains. Samuel Hayes had treated people in remote communities and volunteered on wilderness rescues. The disappearance had become one of those local stories that never completely died. An aircraft went missing. Search teams found nothing. Eventually, people stopped looking. Ethan looked through the trees toward the wreck. Bruno sat beside him. North Star. The word surfaced from memory. North Star something. He couldn't remember the number. He searched the rest of the case. A small notebook had been ruined by moisture. Several pages came apart when Ethan touched them, so he stopped immediately. Beneath it lay a folded piece of waterproof map material. He opened it carefully. No map. Only numbers. 3 sets written in pencil. At first they resembled coordinates, but something was wrong with the format. Ethan copied them into his phone and then onto his paper map. Not standard grid. Bruno lowered his nose toward the case. Ethan gently moved him back. There was one more item, a red cloth pouch. Inside was a medical identification card bearing Samuel Hayes's name. Ethan exhaled slowly. The wreck had an identity now, and identities came with families. People who had waited beside phones. People who had watched search helicopters return without answers. People who had eventually held memorial services without bodies. Ethan knew something about waiting for news. He closed the pouch. We need to get this reported. Bruno suddenly turned. Not toward Ethan. Uphill. His ears rose. His mouth closed. Ethan stopped moving. The forest seemed to change around them. A second earlier, he'd heard wind. Now he heard individual things. Pine needles rubbing together. Water far below. His own breathing. Bruno stood. A stone clicked somewhere beyond the cedar. Ethan's eyes moved uphill. Nothing. He closed the case without fastening it. Bruno took one silent step forward. Ethan touched the dog's harness. Hold. Another sound. A small rock rolling over another. Then stopping. Could be a deer. Could be loose ground. Could be absolutely nothing. Ethan didn't assume. He moved behind the exposed root ball and drew Bruno with him. The fallen cedar gave them concealment and something solid between them and the slope above. Ethan waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing appeared. He studied gaps between the trunks instead of staring at any one place. Movement was easier to catch that way. Bruno's nose worked, then stopped. Ethan whispered, "You got something?" One ear rotated. No growl, no bark. That mattered. If there was a person uphill, Bruno didn't have enough information yet to tell Ethan more. Ethan remained still. The mountain remained still with him. Finally, a raven launched from a distant pine, wings beating loudly through the canopy. No human followed. Ethan checked the time. 2:04. They were miles from the truck, below their planned route, beside an unreported aircraft wreck with weather coming. Enough. He photographed the case and its contents before returning everything exactly as he'd found it. The photograph went back. The wallet. The medical card. The strange numbers. He closed the lid. Bruno looked at him. We leave it. The dog continued watching uphill. If somebody's out here, I'm not carrying evidence through 5 miles of mountain. Ethan covered the case lightly with branches and marked the location on his paper map. He didn't rebury it completely. Authorities would need to find it without destroying the surrounding ground. Then he walked 20 yards uphill and stopped. Bruno remained beside the cedar. Come. The dog hesitated. Ethan's voice softened. We did our part. Bruno finally followed. They climbed toward the ridge. Ethan kept looking back. Nothing followed them. At the aircraft, he paused only long enough to photograph the visible registration markings. Beneath lichen and faded paint, several characters could still be read. He wrote them down. The climb out was harder. Ethan's legs burned, and the temperature fell as clouds swallowed the sun. Bruno stayed close. By the time they regained the higher trail, Ethan could see the fire lookout through the trees, a narrow tower rising above the ridge perhaps 2 miles away. The sight should have brought relief. Instead, Ethan stopped. Something about the whole sequence bothered him. He pulled out the photograph he'd taken of the emergency case, zoomed in. The supplies, the wallet, the flare cartridges, the handwritten numbers. Survivors had possessed flares. They had medical equipment. They had enough time to establish a campsite and cut themselves free. Yet the aircraft had never been found. Maybe weather prevented rescue. Maybe the crash happened far from the original search area. There were a dozen reasonable explanations. Then Ethan remembered the case. Not merely hidden, buried. Why would stranded survivors bury their emergency supplies? Unless they weren't trying to hide them from weather. Unless they were hiding them from someone. Bruno stopped again. Ethan lowered the phone. The dog was looking back toward the ravine. The wind moved through his coat. Yeah, Ethan whispered. He felt it too. Something about that mountain didn't add up. They resumed the climb. Behind them, miles of timber settled into afternoon shadow. Far below, the lost jet disappeared beneath the pines again. And somewhere near the fallen cedar, the buried case waited with 4 names belonging to people the world had assumed died on impact. But Ethan had seen the cut seatbelts. He had seen the fire scar. He had seen food cans stacked by human hands. The official story was already wrong. The question was how wrong. And as Ethan and Bruno climbed toward the lonely fire lookout, neither of them saw the small patch of loose gravel shift on the ridge behind them. One stone rolled downhill, then another, and stopped. By the time Ethan and Bruno reached the fire lookout, daylight had begun draining from the valleys. The tower stood on a granite shoulder above the timber, its narrow windows catching the last weak light. A storage shed leaned against the wind below it, and beside the shed sat the backup generator Ethan had supposedly come all this way to repair. For several seconds, he almost laughed. That morning, the generator had seemed important. Now there was a missing jet buried beneath 18 years of forest behind him. Ethan unlocked the lookout with the key Sheriff Wade Turner had arranged for him and immediately checked the radio. Static filled the small room. He adjusted the frequency. County Dispatch. This is Cole at Granite Ridge Lookout. Radio check. Static. Then a woman's voice broke through. Granite Ridge, you're weak but readable. Ethan gave his name, location, and the partial aircraft registration. He did not give the wreck coordinates. Possible historic aircraft crash site, he said. No immediate casualties. Site appears old. I found evidence suggesting occupants survived initial impact. The radio went quiet. When Wade Turner came on, Ethan recognized the sheriff's gravelly voice immediately. Ethan, repeat that last part. Signs of post-crash survival. Cut restraints. Used food containers. Emergency supplies cached away from the aircraft. Did you disturb anything? Only enough to identify what I was looking at. Photographed it. Put everything back. A pause. Coordinates? Ethan glanced at Bruno. The shepherd stood at the window, looking toward the darkening western slope. I'd rather give those directly. Another pause. Turner understood. Fair enough. Weather's moving faster than forecast. I'm organizing a team. Maya Reynolds is already up near Cedar Basin. She can reach you before anybody else. Copy. And Ethan? Yeah? Don't go back down there tonight. Ethan looked toward the mountain. Wasn't planning to. He meant it when he said it. 20 minutes later, he was kneeling beside the generator with a flashlight between his teeth. Work steadied him. The fuel line was partly clogged. One battery terminal had corroded, and mice had turned a section of insulation into winter housing. Normal problems. Honest problems. He cleaned the connection and tested the starter. The engine coughed once. Bruno lifted his head. At least this one tells me what's wrong. A voice came from behind him. Talking to machinery already? Ethan turned sharply. His hand came up before he recognized the woman standing near the shed. Maya Reynolds raised both hands. Easy. She was bundled in a red wilderness jacket with a medical pack over one shoulder. Dark hair escaped beneath a knit cap. Ethan lowered his hand. You walk quietly. You don't. She looked at Bruno. Bruno studied her for 2 seconds, then relaxed. That's reassuring, Maya said. Don't take it personally. He has standards. Inside the lookout, Ethan showed her the photographs. The moment she saw the registration, her expression changed. North Star 217. Ethan looked up. You know it? Everybody around here over 30 knows it. She enlarged the photograph of the 4 passengers. Samuel Hayes, Rebecca Lane, Peter Collins. Her finger stopped on the heavyset man. Nathan Shaw. Ethan remembered the surname. Businessman, timber, mineral leases, land development. His family still owns 6 companies in the region. And the others? Collins was the pilot. Rebecca Lane did environmental survey work. Hayes was a doctor. Search teams looked for them for months. Maya stared at the image of the wreck. My father volunteered during the search. Ethan said nothing. He used to say that plane couldn't just disappear. It didn't. No. She looked toward the window. It waited. Darkness settled quickly after that. The wind strengthened. Ethan heated canned stew on the lookout's propane stove while Maya reviewed his photographs, and Bruno lay near the door. At 7:46, Bruno stood. No sound. Just up. Ethan noticed immediately. What? Bruno went to the window. Far below, between the trees, 2 lights moved along the abandoned logging road. Headlights. Maya joined Ethan. That's not Wade. You sure? His team would come from the east. The lights disappeared behind timber, then appeared higher. Someone knew another way up. Ethan turned off the interior lamp. Maya looked at him. Why'd you do that? Window makes us a fishbowl. She didn't argue. 25 minutes later, an engine stopped below the tower. Doors closed. 3 men climbed the steps. The first introduced himself as Grant Shaw. He was around 50, clean-shaven, wearing expensive outdoor clothing that looked too new for the mountain. His voice was warm, measured, practiced. Nathan Shaw was my father. That changed the room. Grant produced documents from a waterproof folder. My company, Shaw Aviation Recovery, has maintained a standing interest in locating the aircraft. We have salvage authorization connected to the estate. Maya studied the papers. You got here quickly. We've had teams in the region before. Ethan watched Grant instead of the documents. How'd you know we found it? Scanner traffic. I didn't broadcast coordinates. Grant smiled. No, but Granite Ridge narrows the possibilities. Still a lot of mountain. One of Grant's men shifted near the door. Bruno rose. He didn't growl. He simply moved until he stood between Ethan and Grant. Grant glanced down. Beautiful dog. Ethan didn't respond. Grant continued. I appreciate what you've done, Mr. Cole. Truly. Finding that aircraft means a great deal to my family. There's no reason for you to get tangled in the recovery process. He removed an envelope. I can compensate you for your time. Ethan didn't touch it. For finding your father? For the inconvenience. Maya's eyes moved from the envelope to Grant. Ethan leaned against the table. Funny word. Grant's smile held. What's that? Inconvenience. Silence filled the lookout. Grant put the envelope away. Tomorrow morning, my people can secure the wreck before the weather worsens. The north side of the fuselage is unstable anyway. Better not to have civilians climbing around it. Ethan felt something inside him become very still. He didn't look at Maya, didn't look at Bruno. He simply asked, You've seen the wreck? Grant hesitated. Not personally. Your crew? Historical survey material. Ethan nodded as though satisfied. Right. But there had been no historical survey of a wreck nobody had found, and Ethan had never told anyone that the exposed approach was on the north side. Grant changed the subject. What exactly did you remove? Remove? From the aircraft? Nothing. Any documents? Ethan let half a second pass. Should there be documents? Grant's expression barely changed. Barely. But Ethan saw it. A tightening at the corner of the mouth. A breath held too long. No, Grant said. I'm asking because old crash sites can contain sensitive personal material. Ethan nodded. Of course. Grant left 10 minutes later. His men followed. Bruno watched them descend the steps. Maya waited until the engine started below. He knew. Yeah. About the fuselage. Yeah. Should we call Wade? We will. Ethan looked through the dark window as the headlights moved down the mountain, but not over the same channel they were listening to. Before dawn, the weather eased enough for Ethan and Bruno to hike back toward the truck, while Maya remained at the lookout waiting for Turner. The Ford was exactly where Ethan had left it. Nothing broken, nothing missing. He unlocked the driver's door, then stopped. The blanket behind the seat had been folded differently. His toolbox latch was closed, but the socket tray inside sat backward. The cardboard box from his divorce had been moved half an inch from the dust line beneath it. Ethan didn't touch anything. He walked around the truck, no forced entry. Whoever had searched it knew how to get inside without leaving obvious damage. Bruno sniffed the passenger door, then the rear wheel, then returned to Ethan. They didn't want the truck. Ethan opened the glove compartment. Registration still there. Cash hidden beneath the owner's manual still there. Nothing valuable had been taken. Maya's words came back to him. He knew. Ethan looked toward the mountains. Grant hadn't sent someone to steal. He had sent someone to look. Which meant there was something connected to North Star 217 that mattered enough to search a homeless mechanic's truck in the middle of nowhere. Ethan closed the door quietly. Then Bruno looked toward the dark timber and went completely still. For several seconds, Ethan heard nothing. Bruno stood beside the truck with his head slightly lowered, nose pointed toward the trees. His body wasn't rigid the way it had been above the wreck. This was different. He was sorting something. Ethan checked his watch. 3:17 a.m. Cold fog had settled across the turnout, thick enough to swallow the road 20 yards away. Moisture gathered on the Ford's hood and ran in narrow silver lines. Bruno. One ear turned toward him. The dog's nose returned to the passenger door. He sniffed along the handle, then followed the scent toward the rear of the truck. Ethan understood. Whoever searched the Ford had left something behind that couldn't be seen. Scent. Bruno moved toward the timber. Ethan didn't follow immediately. He pulled out his radio and tried Maya. Static. He changed position. Maya, this is Ethan. A broken reply came through. Copy. Where? At my truck. Someone searched it. Bruno has a trail. Static. Then clearer. Don't follow it alone. Ethan looked at Bruno. The shepherd was already staring into the fog. Wasn't planning to. 28 minutes later, Maya appeared through the trees carrying her medical pack and a headlamp. She looked tired and irritated. You have a strange definition of a generator job. So I've been told. Turner? Still bringing a team in from the east. Washouts slowed them. Maya looked at Bruno. He still have it? Ethan nodded. Bruno hadn't wandered more than a few feet from the beginning of the trail. Ethan packed quickly. Water, map, compass, first aid kit, insulation layer, headlamp, emergency blanket. He left anything unnecessary behind. Maya watched him mark the truck's position on his paper map. You really think somebody came through here on foot? I think Bruno does. Good enough for me. They entered the trees. The fog changed everything. Headlamps reflected against suspended moisture, turning the forest into a narrow tunnel of white. Ethan kept his beam low instead of shining it ahead and destroying his night vision. Bruno worked slowly. Nose down. Pause. Move. Check. At each change in terrain, Ethan marked their route with small strips of biodegradable survey tape Maya carried, placing them where they could be seen on the return climb. You're expecting to get turned around? Maya whispered. I'm expecting the weather not to care what I expect. They descended. The scent trail eventually crossed the old route toward the wreck, but continued beyond it. That bothered Ethan. Whoever had searched his truck hadn't simply returned to the logging road. They had gone deeper into the drainage. Bruno led them to a narrow creek. Water moved black between pale stones. He stopped at the bank, searched upstream, then downstream. Lost it? Maya asked. Maybe. Bruno crossed 20 feet upstream, sniffed the opposite bank, then doubled back. Suddenly he climbed onto a flat rock. His head lifted. He stepped across. Found it. They followed. On the other side, the terrain steepened into loose scree. Ethan stopped. The slope above them disappeared into fog. Spread out. Maya moved several feet away so their combined weight wouldn't load the same section. Bruno stayed near Ethan. They crossed one step at a time. Ethan tested each placement before transferring his weight. Halfway across, Bruno stopped. Come. Nothing. Ethan stepped toward the next patch of gravel. Bruno moved sideways and planted himself directly across Ethan's legs. Bruno. The shepherd refused to move. Ethan looked down. Then he heard it. Tick. A pebble bounced beneath his forward boot. Another followed. Ethan shifted his weight backward. The ground where he'd been about to step suddenly folded. A section of scree slid away in a rushing hiss. Rocks poured down the slope and vanished into the fog. Maya dropped to one knee. Ethan! I'm good. The slide lasted perhaps 6 seconds. It sounded much longer. When it stopped, a dark gap remained where Ethan's next step would have landed. He looked at Bruno. The dog's ears buffs were forward. Calm again. Ethan put one hand against his neck. Good call. Bruno leaned into the touch for half a second, then resumed working. They detoured around the unstable section. Beyond the scree, the forest changed. Older trees, less undergrowth. Bruno moved faster. Dawn had begun to thin the fog when Maya noticed the first stone pile. That natural? Ethan crouched. 3 rocks had been stacked beside a tree. 2 balanced. No. They found another 40 yards away, then a third. Trail markers. Not modern ones. Moss covered the lower stones. Crash survivors? Maya asked. Could be. The markers led into a shallow basin hidden beneath the ridge. At its center stood what remained of an old hunting shelter. The roof had collapsed years ago. One wall leaned against a pine, and rusted stovepipe protruded through rotten boards. Bruno circled it once, then went beneath the collapsed porch. His claws scraped dirt. Ethan crouched. Again? Maya almost smiled. Apparently he likes buried things. Bruno dug beside a rotting floor beam. Ethan helped move loose soil by hand. His fingers struck something cylindrical. He stopped. A steel tube, about 18 inches long, sealed at both ends. Maya knelt beside him. That wasn't left accidentally. Ethan lifted it free. The tube was wrapped in the remains of waxed cloth. One cap loosened after several careful turns. Inside was a notebook sealed in 2 plastic bags. Maya exhaled. The first page carried a name. Samuel Hayes, MD. For a moment, neither spoke. Ethan turned the page. The handwriting was cramped but readable. October 14th. Engine trouble over mountains. Collins attempted emergency landing. Impact severe. All 4 alive initially. Ethan read faster. Peter Collins had suffered serious leg and chest injuries. Rebecca Lane had cuts and a shoulder injury. Hayes had treated both. Nathan Shaw was ambulatory. They had rationed food, used the fuselage for shelter, moved supplies away from the aircraft. Exactly what Ethan had seen. Maya sat on a fallen beam. So they survived, at least 3 of them for days. Ethan turned another page. The entries changed. Shorter, less medical, more cautious. Nathan increasingly agitated. Arguments regarding documents. Rebecca refuses to surrender survey records. Ethan looked at Maya. Survey records. She leaned closer. He continued. A later entry mentioned the emergency locator transmitter. Ethan stopped, read the line again. What? He handed her the journal. Maya read silently. Her face tightened. That doesn't make sense. It does if Hayes knew what he was looking at. The entry was brief. Nathan removed the beacon battery before we understood what he intended. Maya looked toward the ruined shelter. You're saying they crashed, survived, and somebody disabled the thing that could help rescuers find them? I'm saying Hayes wrote that Nathan did. Why? Ethan turned the page. Nothing. The next sheet had been torn out. So had the one after it. Then another. 3 missing pages. The forest suddenly felt colder. Bruno stood outside the shelter, his head turned toward the trees. Ethan closed the journal. Maya whispered, Those pages didn't rot. No, the edges were too clean. Someone had removed them, deliberately. Ethan looked at the steel tube, the old stone markers, then at the fog closing around the basin. The mystery had changed. North Star 217 had not simply vanished because mountains were large and search crews were unlucky. The people aboard had survived long enough to wait for rescue, and according to the man who treated their injuries, one of those survivors had deliberately made sure the rescue couldn't hear them. Bruno gave a low, warning breath. Ethan rose. Somewhere beyond the ruined shelter, a branch snapped. Bruno moved first. He stepped between Ethan and the trees, head low, ears forward. Ethan raised one hand toward Maya. Stay. Neither spoke. The fog hung between the pines in pale strips. Ethan watched the spaces between trunks rather than the trunks themselves, waiting for movement. Another sound came from uphill. Leaves shifting. Then a shape appeared. A mule deer bounded through the fog, crossed the basin, and disappeared between the trees. Maya released the breath she'd been holding. That nearly took 10 years off my life. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Bruno watched the direction the deer had come from. Then his posture softened. Probably what we heard. Probably? Ethan looked at the torn pages in Hayes's journal. That's as much certainty as I'm buying today. They returned to the lookout after sunrise. Sheriff Turner had finally reached the ridge with 2 deputies and a Forest Service ranger. Ethan handed him the steel tube and journal, then walked Wade through everything they had found. The wreck, the buried emergency case, Grant Shaw, the searched truck, the trail, the beacon entry. Turner's weathered face grew harder with each detail. Nobody goes back to that aircraft alone, he said. Ethan nodded. Turner pointed at him. That includes you, I heard you. You heard me yesterday, too. Maya covered a smile with her coffee cup. Turner took the journal to the table. The pages were photographed before anyone handled them further. With weather deteriorating, the wreck itself would have to wait for a properly equipped team. For the next hour, Ethan and Maya read from the photographs. Hayes's entries began like medical notes. Pulse rates, injuries, food, temperature. Then the tone changed. Rebecca Lane had been carrying land surveys connected to proposed mineral development west of the Salmon River. According to Hayes, she had discovered discrepancies between county records and documents provided by Nathan Shaw's company. Families had sold property for a fraction of its later value. Some had apparently been told access roads would close. Others had been warned that environmental contamination would make their land worthless. The journal never called it a conspiracy. Hayes simply recorded what Rebecca told him. Names, dates, parcel numbers. Nathan wanted the survey material. Rebecca refused. On the third night after the crash, Hayes wrote that Nathan removed the emergency beacon battery, not because the battery was failing, because he did not want rescuers arriving before he recovered the records. Maya stared at the photograph of the page. He stranded injured people on a mountain over paperwork. People have done worse for less. She looked at Ethan. You say that like you've seen it. Ethan turned the page. The next entry described Peter Collins developing difficulty breathing. Hayes believed he had internal injuries. Rebecca's shoulder had worsened. Nathan remained physically capable. Then came the missing pages. 3 of them. Afterward, the handwriting became less steady. Collins cannot travel. Rebecca says we must move the records. N followed her. Another entry. If anyone finds this, the numbers are not coordinates. Start where the aircraft stopped. Use the nose as 0. Ethan sat forward. The numbers from the case. Maya nodded. Bearings? Maybe. Before he could say more, a helicopter passed somewhere beyond the ridge. At first it was distant. Thump, thump, thump. Ethan stopped reading. The sound grew louder. Thump, thump, thump. His thumb pressed against the edge of the table. The lookout vanished at the corners. For an instant he saw a different valley. Brown mountains, a damaged aircraft sitting hard on one skid, men moving beneath rotor wash, a headset crushing his ears, someone grabbing his vest. We're lifting. Recovery element is inbound. Ethan's chair scraped backward. Maya looked up. Ethan? He was already outside. Cold air struck his face. The helicopter crossed high above the western ridge, probably Forest Service, too far away to see clearly. Ethan watched it disappear, then kept watching. Once. He scanned the horizon. Twice. Nothing. A third time. Still nothing. He knew there was nothing. His body checked anyway. Bruno came through the door and stopped beside him. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. Don't. Maya had followed but stayed several feet away. I didn't say anything. That's worse. The helicopter sound faded. Ethan looked down into the valley. Years ago, another aircraft had carried him away from a bad LZ in Afghanistan. There had been men on the ground beside a damaged helicopter. The recovery element was coming. That was what Ethan had been told. Weather changed. Then contact farther north pulled resources away. The recovery team arrived late. Too late for 2 men. Ethan had spent years rearranging the same memory. What if he'd refused the order? What if he'd stayed? What if he'd made somebody understand how bad the situation was? Maya leaned against the railing. You knew people who didn't get picked up. It wasn't really a question. Ethan kept his eyes on the mountains. We had a bird down. Bruno sat against his leg. Afghanistan. We got the wounded out. I was told another element would recover the crew and 2 men providing security. His jaw moved before the next words came. I left. You were ordered out. I left. Maya said nothing. Next element got delayed. Ethan looked at his hands. I spent a long time telling myself I followed procedure. The wind moved across the lookout. Didn't make their families feel any better. Did blaming yourself? Ethan looked at her. She didn't soften the question. He almost respected her for it. No. Inside, the journal waited on the table. Ethan returned to it. He read the beacon entry again. Then Hayes's note about Collins being unable to travel. The words seemed to tighten around something old inside him. People waiting beside a broken aircraft. People trusting someone else to come. People who didn't know whether anyone was coming at all. He closed the journal. Harder than necessary. Give it to Turner. Maya frowned. What? I'm done. Ethan, I found the plane. I reported it. Sheriff's here. He stood. That's the end of my part. He packed his tools. Bruno watched from the doorway. Maya didn't stop him. Maybe she understood that pushing would only make him move faster. Ethan shouldered his pack. Come on, Bruno. The shepherd remained seated. Bruno. Come. Nothing. Ethan walked toward the stairs. The dog turned his head toward the western slope. Not today. Bruno stood. For a moment, Ethan expected him to follow. Instead, the shepherd descended the lookout steps and headed toward the trail leading back to the wreck. Bruno. The dog continued. Ethan's voice sharpened. Bruno, come! The shepherd stopped 20 yards away. He looked back. Ethan had rarely seen him disobey a recall. Not like this. Bruno looked toward the mountain, then back at Ethan. Maya appeared in the doorway behind him. Neither spoke. Bruno turned away and walked toward the ravine alone. For 3 seconds, Ethan didn't move. Then he dropped his pack. Bruno! The shepherd kept walking, not running. That somehow made it worse. He moved with the same deliberate pace he'd used when he first caught the scent of the aircraft, stopping once to test the wind before continuing down the trail. Bruno, come! The dog stopped. He looked back. His ears were forward, his expression calm. Ethan pointed toward himself. Here. Bruno had obeyed that command in snowstorms, around wildlife, beside highways, and once when a bull elk charged through brush less than 50 yards away. Now he simply stood there, then turned toward the mountain again. Ethan swore under his breath. Maya came down the lookout steps. Want me to get Turner? No. Ethan. He's my dog. He picked up his pack. And apparently, he's decided I'm an idiot. Maya almost smiled. Maybe listen to him. Ethan started after Bruno. The shepherd waited until Ethan was within 20 yards, then moved again. This time, Ethan didn't call him back. They descended through the timber in silence. Bruno wasn't retracing the scent trail from earlier. He passed the route to the hunting shelter and continued toward the wreck. By late morning, the clouds had lowered enough to scrape the upper ridges. The jet appeared through the trees like a pale scar. Bruno went directly to the fallen cedar. The emergency case remained where Ethan had left it. The dog sniffed around the disturbed earth, then moved beyond it. That's not what you brought me back for. Bruno ignored him. He stopped beside a pine and sniffed the trunk. Ethan noticed a mark cut into the bark. 2 shallow lines crossing at an angle. Old. Nearly swallowed by growth. He'd seen it before and dismissed it as damage. Bruno moved another 30 yards. A second tree carried a similar mark. Ethan pulled out the photograph of Hayes's journal. If anyone finds this, the numbers are not coordinates. Start where the aircraft stopped. Use the nose as 0. Ethan looked toward the wreck, then at the numbers he'd copied from the buried case. Bearings. He returned to the aircraft. The crushed nose pointed roughly southeast. Ethan set his compass against that line, corrected for the orientation, then studied the first notation. A bearing. A distance. Not a destination recorded on a map. Directions measured from the wreck itself. Bruno sat beside him. You could have just told me. The shepherd panted once. Right. Ethan radioed Turner. This time the sheriff answered. Cole, where are you? At the aircraft. There was a long silence. I seem to remember telling you something about that. Blame my dog. I'll arrest both of you. Ethan gave him the discovery. Turner's irritation disappeared. Do not move anything if you find it. Understood. And don't go farther than you can safely return. Storm cells are building south. Copy. Ethan began with the first bearing. Bruno worked ahead while Ethan navigated. The line led away from the wreck through dense timber, crossed a shallow drainage, then climbed around a granite spine. At the measured distance, they found another tree scar. Confirmation. The second bearing took them lower. Cell service vanished completely. Ethan shut off unnecessary functions on his phone to preserve the battery and relied on compass, map, slope direction, and terrain. Clouds made the light flat. Every ridge began resembling the next. This was how people got lost while carrying a device that insisted they weren't. Bruno never cared what the screen said. He cared about scent. The final bearing pointed toward a narrow ravine Ethan hadn't noticed on the topographic map. Flash floods had carved it deeper since the map data was collected, leaving steep walls of gravel and exposed stone. Ethan stopped above it. Bad place to get trapped. Bruno descended along the edge rather than entering the bottom. Ethan followed. 20 minutes later, the dog froze. His nose lowered. He moved toward a shallow overhang beneath a slab of granite, then stopped. Ethan knew before he reached him. A boot protruded from beneath collapsed stone and old debris. The leather had dried and split years ago. Ethan removed his cap. Easy, boy. He approached carefully. The remains were mostly sheltered beneath the overhang, clothing reduced to fragments beneath dirt and time. Ethan didn't touch them. He photographed the location. Then he saw something lying near the right side. A rectangular battery unit. Weathered. Corroded. But the faded aviation markings were still recognizable. Ethan crouched. The missing beacon battery. Hayes had told the truth. Someone had carried it away from the aircraft. Bruno sniffed near the remains, then backed off. Ethan studied what remained of the clothing. A belt buckle. Watch. Fragments of a heavy coat. Then a metallic glint beneath the ribs. A corner. Not part of the body. A case. Dark metal, perhaps 12 inches wide, wedged beneath stone and protected by the overhang. Ethan's pulse quickened. He photographed it before moving closer. A broken leather strap remained attached to one side. Someone had carried this case against their body. The old photograph came back to him. Nathan Shaw wearing the heavy coat. Ethan stared at the remains. If this was Nathan, then Grant Shaw's father had not vanished somewhere beyond the wreck. He had died here, with the beacon battery beside him, and with something hidden beneath his body. Ethan reached toward the case. Bruno spun. The reaction was instant. His hackles rose from shoulders to tail. A low growl rolled from his chest. Ethan withdrew his hand. He didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he listened. Gravel shifted above the ravine. One step, then another. Human. Ethan slowly stood. He moved half a pace sideways, putting the granite wall behind one shoulder so nobody could approach unseen from both directions. Bruno remained between him and the sound. A figure appeared at the upper edge. Grant Shaw. No recovery crew. No deputies. Just Grant. Mud stained his expensive boots. His jacket was damp, and his breathing suggested he'd been following them for some time. His eyes moved from Ethan to the remains, then to the battery. Something in his face collapsed for half a second. Not surprise. Recognition. Ethan saw it. Grant carefully descended several feet into the ravine. "Mr. Cole," Ethan said nothing. Grant's gaze settled on the metal case beneath the remains. Bruno's growl deepened. "Control your dog. He is controlled." Grant stopped. The wind pushed through the ravine. Ethan glanced once at the beacon battery, then back at Grant. "You knew where this trail went." Grant's jaw tightened. "I knew my father may have survived the crash. That's not what I said." Silence. Ethan watched his hands. Empty. That didn't make him harmless. Grant took another step. Bruno moved forward. Grant stopped again. Ethan's voice stayed quiet. "How long have you known?" Grant looked at the remains. "My entire adult life has been people telling me what my father supposedly did. Hayes wrote that he disabled the beacon. You don't know what happened here." "Then tell me." Grant's eyes returned to the case. Not Ethan. The case. And Ethan finally understood why somebody had searched his truck. They hadn't been looking for photographs of the aircraft. They hadn't cared about the emergency supplies. They had been looking for whatever Nathan Shaw carried away from North Star 217. Ethan crouched slightly, preparing to retrieve the case. Grant's voice changed. The polished warmth disappeared. What remained was low and urgent. "Don't." Ethan paused. Bruno stood rigid between them. Grant took one careful breath, then said the words that turned an 18-year-old mystery into something happening right now. "Don't open that." Ethan kept his hand away from the case. Not because Grant had ordered him to, because Bruno had changed. The shepherd's growl had stopped. That was more concerning than the sound. He stood absolutely still, ears moving between Grant and the canyon behind them, gathering information Ethan couldn't yet hear. Grant descended another step. "Move away from it." Ethan straightened. His hands remained visible. He shifted slightly to his right, placing himself where he could see Grant without turning his back on the narrow ravine. Grant noticed. "You always stand like that? Like what? Like you're waiting for somebody to make a mistake." Ethan looked at him. "Are you planning to?" For the first time, Grant's polished expression cracked. He looked exhausted rather than dangerous. Mud covered his pants to the knees. A branch had scratched one cheek. Whatever expensive confidence he'd brought to the lookout was gone. "My father disappeared when I was 32, Grant said. "Do you understand what that does to a family?" Ethan glanced toward the remains. Somewhat. People accused him of everything. Fraud, intimidation, stealing land, manipulating surveys. Were they wrong? Grant's jaw tightened. "You read one dead man's notebook. I found your father's beacon battery beside his body. You don't know why it's there. Then explain it." Grant looked away. That told Ethan more than an argument would have. Wind moved over the canyon rim. Bruno's ears flicked again. Grant pointed toward the document case. "Those records belong to my family. Maybe. They were taken from my father's company. According to who? My father. Ethan studied him. There it was. Not certainty. Inheritance. A story passed from one person to another until protecting it became the same thing as believing it. Grant stepped closer. My father told people before that flight that Rebecca Lane had copied confidential records. He believed she intended to destroy several legitimate business agreements. And Hayes? Hayes didn't understand what he was looking at. Convenient. Grant's voice sharpened. You think because you found an airplane, you understand 18 years of history? No. Ethan glanced at the remains. But dead men don't usually carry emergency beacon batteries miles from a crash by accident. Grant's face tightened. He descended another step. Bruno moved forward. Ethan touched 2 fingers against his harness. Hold. The dog stopped immediately. Grant looked at him. You see? That's the problem. You keep acting like I'm here to hurt you. You searched my truck? Silence. Ethan waited. Grant's eyes shifted. That was enough. Thought so. I needed to know what you'd removed. You could have asked. I did. After somebody searched it. Grant exhaled. You don't understand the stakes. Then stop saying that and tell me. The canyon went quiet. Grant looked at his father's remains. When he spoke again, the anger had drained from his voice. My father built Shaw Resource Holdings from nothing. After the plane disappeared, the company nearly collapsed. Lawsuits came. Families claimed he'd cheated them. Investors ran. I spent years putting it back together. That's what you're protecting? I'm protecting hundreds of employees who had nothing to do with any of this. And your father's name. Grant didn't answer. Ethan nodded. Mostly his name. Grant looked at him then. There was pain there. Real pain. It didn't make him innocent. But it made him human. My father sent letters before the flight, Grant said. He told me Lane and others were trying to frame him. He said if anything happened, I should protect the company records from people who would twist them. Ethan's gaze dropped toward the case. So you knew records were on the plane. I knew something was. Which is why you knew the fuselage. Grant hesitated. My father had described the aircraft layout. Years later, private searchers found pieces of debris, but never the main wreck. I had enough information to narrow the site, and you didn't tell authorities. I had nothing certain to tell them. Ethan almost laughed. Sure. Grant stepped closer. Give me the case. No. I am asking. So am I. Back up. Grant stopped. The 2 men stared at each other. Ethan could feel an old part of his mind working without permission. Distance. Hands. Terrain. Exit. Bruno. He moved half a step left. Now Grant would have to shift his eyes farther to watch both Ethan and the shepherd. A small advantage. Nothing dramatic. Just space. Grant noticed anyway. Military? Used to be. That explains a lot. Doesn't explain you. Grant's eyes hardened. Give me the case, Ethan. The use of his first name sounded wrong. Ethan's hand lowered toward the document case. Not to surrender it. To secure it. Bruno's head snapped away from Grant. Ethan stopped. The dog turned toward the upper canyon. Ears rigid. What? Bruno inhaled. One sharp breath. Then another. Grant looked toward the same direction. I don't hear anything. Ethan raised a hand. Quiet. At first there was only wind. Then Ethan heard something underneath it. A low rushing sound. Distant. Continuous. His eyes moved to the canyon walls, the ravine floor. Broken branches lodged 6 feet above the current dry channel. Debris lines. Old flood marks. His stomach dropped. Water. Grant frowned. What? Ethan looked at the sky. The clouds directly above them weren't releasing much rain. Didn't matter. Somewhere higher in the watershed, a storm had opened. The sound grew. Bruno backed away from the channel. Ethan pointed uphill. Move! Grant looked toward the case. Take it. No time. We're not leaving it. Ethan stepped toward higher ground. Grant, climb! The rushing became a roar. Not loud yet, but growing fast. Grant crouched and grabbed the handle of the document case. It was pinned beneath stone. He pulled. Nothing. Leave it. I can get it. Ethan looked upstream. The first trickle of muddy water appeared around the bend, then another. Within seconds, the dry channel darkened. Bruno barked once, sharp, urgent. Ethan climbed 3 steps up the side of the ravine and turned. Grant was still pulling at the case. Shaw, it'll come loose. The water reached his boots. An inch, then 3. It was rising impossibly fast. Ethan came back down. He grabbed Grant's jacket. Grant shoved his arm away. Get off me! Ethan pointed upstream. Grant finally looked. His face changed. A wall of brown water rounded the bend, carrying branches, foam, and stones. Not towering, not cinematic. Worse, dense, fast, real. Climb! Grant released the case. They scrambled toward the ravine wall. Bruno was already above them, then turned and came back 2 steps, as if counting Ethan. Go! Ethan shouted. The shepherd climbed. Grant slipped. Ethan caught the back of his jacket and shoved him toward a root. Water slammed through the place where they'd been standing seconds earlier. Nathan Shaw's remains disappeared beneath muddy current. The beacon battery spun away. The document case broke loose from beneath the rocks. Grant saw it. No. He reached down. Ethan grabbed him. Forget it. The case struck a boulder, spun once, and rushed downstream. Bruno saw it too. Bruno, stay! The shepherd looked at Ethan, then at the case. A broken tree limb shot past beneath them. The water rose another foot. Ethan tightened his grip on Grant. Bruno! But the dog's body had already shifted, and Ethan knew that look. Bruno had decided there was still something left to save. Bruno, stay! The command cut through the roar. For 1 second, Bruno obeyed. He stood above the flood line, muscles tight, watching the document case tumble through the brown water below. Then Grant's boot slipped. His body dropped hard against the ravine wall. The root he was holding tore free. Ethan! Grant slid into the current. Ethan lunged. His left hand caught Grant's jacket near the shoulder, but the sudden weight dragged Ethan to one knee. Water struck Grant sideways, pinning his legs against a fallen trunk wedged between 2 boulders. Grab the rock! I can't! Use your left hand! Grant reached. Missed. Ethan flattened himself against the slope and hooked one boot behind a granite projection. The old calculations came without thought. Anchor, leverage, don't fight the current directly. Again! Grant reached and caught the rock. Hold it! A branch slammed into the trunk below them. The entire barrier shook. Ethan pulled. Grant cried out as his trapped leg twisted. I can't move! Ethan looked downstream. The document case had lodged temporarily against another pile of debris perhaps 40 yards away. For 1 strange second, he saw both problems at once. Grant. The case. A man who had followed him into the mountain and threatened everything they had found. Evidence that might explain 18 years of lies, mission, life. His mind offered the old answer automatically. Secure what matters most. He had obeyed that kind of thinking before. People on one side of a decision, mission on the other. Someone promising another team would come. Ethan looked at Grant. No. Grant stared at him through the spray. What? Nothing. Ethan released the strap of his pack and let it fall onto higher ground. Then he climbed down. What are you doing? Getting you out. The current hit Ethan's boots. Cold punched through immediately. He kept one hand on the rock and reached beneath the water with the other. Grant's leg was wedged between the fallen trunk and a smaller branch. Don't move. Wasn't planning on it. Ethan felt along the branch. It wasn't holding Grant's full weight. Good. On 3, pull uphill. Grant nodded. 1. The water surged. 2. Something struck Ethan's shin. Pain flashed upward. 3. Ethan lifted the branch. Grant pulled. His leg came free. Go! Grant scrambled upward. Ethan shoved from below until Grant reached the shelf. Then Ethan climbed after him. A bark snapped through the canyon. Ethan turned. Bruno was no longer above them. No. The shepherd was moving along the bank downstream, following the case. Bruno! The dog looked back. Leave it! The case broke loose again. Bruno ran. Bruno! Ethan started after him. Grant grabbed Ethan's sleeve. You'll get killed! Ethan tore free. Stay high! He moved downstream along the slope, keeping above the main current. Bruno disappeared behind a bend. Ethan heard stones grinding beneath the flood. Branches cracked. Water hammered granite. Then Bruno appeared again on a narrow gravel shelf. The document case had lodged near the bank. He stepped toward it. Stay! Bruno paused. Ethan was 20 yards away. Good boy. Stay. For one heartbeat, Ethan thought he'd reached him. Then a surge struck the debris pile. The case spun free. Bruno lunged. His jaws closed around the leather strap. Bruno, no! A tree limb came sideways through the water. Ethan saw it. Bruno didn't. The limb struck the shepherd across the flank and rear leg. Bruno gave one short yelp. The sound went through Ethan like metal. The dog rolled. The case disappeared beneath the water. Bruno tried to stand. Another surge hit him. Then he was gone. Bruno! Ethan slid down the slope. His boots hit the edge of the current. Grant shouted from somewhere behind him. Ethan couldn't hear the words. He saw black water, brown foam, branches, nothing else. Bruno! He moved downstream, too fast. His foot slipped and he struck one hand against rock. He barely felt it. Bruno, no bark, no movement, nothing. Ethan scanned both banks. He knew better than to enter the main current. Knowing didn't help. Every part of him wanted to go in. He forced himself to look instead. Eddies, debris catches, inside bends, places where the current might throw something living out instead of carrying it farther. He ran. The ravine widened. Water spread across a gravel bar. Ethan saw a dark shape against a boulder. He jumped down. A piece of bark. Not Bruno. He kicked it away. Come on, buddy. His voice broke. Come on! Grant caught up, limping badly. We need to get higher. Ethan ignored him. The water's still rising. Then get higher. Ethan, go! Grant stopped. Ethan continued searching. 10 yards downstream, he found tracks in wet mud above the flood line. Paw prints. His breath caught. Bruno. He crouched. One print. Another. The dog had reached the bank. Ethan followed them. 3 yards. 5. Then they ended at a pale stone. Blood marked its surface. Not much. Enough. Ethan touched it with 2 fingers. Fresh. His hands began shaking. The canyon sound changed. Not quieter, but farther away. He stared at the blood. A different mountain entered his mind. Men waiting beside a damaged aircraft. A helicopter lifting. His own hands gripping a seat while somebody said recovery was inbound. He had spent years imagining the moment he should have stayed. Now Bruno had disappeared because Ethan hadn't been able to stop him. No. Grant stood several yards away. Ethan rose. No. He moved downstream. Ethan, search teams need to know where we are. Then call them. No signal. Climb until you get one. Grant stared at him. What about the case? Ethan stopped. The question seemed to come from another world. He turned slowly. Grant looked toward the water. The documents. I don't care. Grant fell silent. Ethan looked back at the canyon. For days, everything had been about the jet. The survivors, the beacon, the journal, Nathan Shaw. Whatever was inside that case. None of it mattered now, not compared with one black and tan head appearing above the rocks. One bark. One movement. Anything. Ethan walked until his injured shin began to stiffen. He kept going. The rain strengthened. Cold water ran down the back of his neck. He called Bruno's name until it became rough and useless in his throat. No answer. At another gravel bar, Ethan found a strip of black fur caught on a broken branch. He closed his fingers around it. 7 years. Truck stops. Cheap motels when he could afford them. Cold mornings. Bad nights. Bruno sitting beside him when the walls felt too close. Bruno watching doors Ethan knew didn't need watching. Bruno pressing one shoulder against his knee until Afghanistan became Idaho again. Ethan lowered his head. For several seconds he couldn't move. Then he heard something. He raised his face. Water. Wind. Rain tapping leaves. Nothing. He almost started walking again. Then it came a second time. Faint. So faint he couldn't tell whether memory had made it. A single bark. Ethan froze. Grant looked at him. What? Ethan raised one hand. Silence. They listened. 5 seconds. 10. Then, somewhere beyond the flooded bend ahead, a bark came again. Weak, but real. Ethan's eyes closed for half a heartbeat. Then he was moving. Bruno! He climbed over a fallen tree and disappeared around the bend. Behind him, Grant limped after him. The flood kept roaring through the canyon. But for Ethan, there was only one sound left in the entire mountain. A dog calling back. Bruno! Ethan pushed through wet brush until the canyon narrowed around another bend. Nothing. He stopped. Listened. Rain struck his jacket. Floodwater rolled stones against one another below, producing a deep grinding sound that seemed to come from inside the mountain. Then the bark came again. Upstream of him. Not far. Ethan turned toward a wall of driftwood trapped against granite. Bruno! A faint whine answered. Ethan saw him. The shepherd lay on a narrow gravel shelf, no wider than a pickup bed, wedged between a fallen log and the rock wall. Half his body was hidden behind branches. Stay. The word came out, shaking. Bruno lifted his head. His ears tried to rise. One managed it. Ethan nearly laughed and nearly broke apart at the same time. I'm coming. He studied the approach before moving. The direct route crossed water too fast to risk. He climbed higher, moved along the slope, then lowered himself behind the gravel shelf using exposed roots. Grant reached the ridge above. "Can you get to him?" "Yeah." Ethan didn't know if that was true. He said it anyway. His boots touched gravel. Bruno tried to stand. "No. Down." The dog obeyed. Ethan dropped beside him. His hands went to work before his mind could interfere. Breathing first, airway clear, chest moving. No obvious major bleeding from the neck or chest. A deep cut ran along Bruno's flank, the fur around it dark and wet. His right hind leg was already swelling, and one front paw pad had been torn badly enough that every attempt to shift weight left another small red mark on the gravel. But he was alive. "Look at me." Bruno's brown eyes found his. "Good." Ethan removed his wet outer layer and spread insulation beneath the dog's chest, getting him off the cold gravel. Then he applied pressure to the flank wound. Bruno whined. "I know." The dog's head lowered. "I know, buddy." Ethan's hands were trembling so badly that he had to stop for 1 second. He pressed his palms together, breathed once, then returned to work. "I'm here." Bruno watched him. Ethan wrapped the wound carefully, checking that the bandage controlled bleeding without restricting breathing or movement. "I'm here." He examined the hind leg without forcing it straight. Possibly bruised. Possibly worse. Not something to test here. "I'm here." Bruno's tail moved once against the gravel. Ethan lowered his forehead to the dog's head. For a few seconds, the mountain disappeared. No Jet, no Grant, no 18-year-old mystery. Just warm fur beneath his face and Bruno's breath against his wrist. A radio crackled above. Grant shouted, "People coming!" Ethan looked up. Voices answered from farther along the ridge. Sheriff Turner appeared first, followed by Maya and 2 members of the mountain rescue team. Maya saw Bruno and immediately began descending. "Don't move him yet." "Wasn't going to." She reached the shelf and knelt beside Ethan. Her hands were steadier than his. She checked Bruno, then looked at Ethan. "He's hurt. I noticed. But he's here." Ethan nodded. That was all he trusted himself to do. Turner remained above, directing the rescue team to establish a safer route. Maya reached beneath one of the branches beside Bruno. "What's this?" Ethan looked. Something dark was trapped beneath the shepherd's front legs. At first he thought it was part of the driftwood. Then he saw the leather strap. The document case. Bruno had it pinned against his chest. Ethan stared at him. "You stubborn." His voice failed. Maya smiled despite herself. He went after it. "Yeah." Bruno opened one eye. Ethan touched his ear. "We're going to discuss your judgment later." The case was battered but still closed. Turner insisted it remain sealed until they were safely above the flood channel. The rescue team lifted Bruno in a soft stretcher, keeping his injured leg supported. Ethan climbed beside them, one hand touching the edge whenever terrain allowed. Only after they reached a sheltered shelf well above the water did Turner examine the case. He photographed the exterior, then opened it. Inside were waterproof folders, property deeds, survey maps, copies of mineral leases, letters carrying signatures and dates. Rebecca Lane's handwritten notes appeared on several pages, comparing original county records with later versions. Maya looked through one folder. She copied everything. Turner nodded, and Nathan carried it away. At the bottom of the case was an envelope protected inside 2 layers of plastic. Samuel Hayes had written a name across the front. "To whoever finds us." Ethan stared at it. Turner opened the envelope. The letter was several pages long. Hayes explained what happened after the missing journal pages. Rebecca confronted Nathan over the disabled beacon. Nathan attempted to take the documents. During the struggle, he fell against rock and suffered injuries Hayes could not treat with the supplies available. Nathan died the following day. Rebecca, still able to walk, took part of the evidence and tried to descend toward the valley to find help. Hayes stayed. Peter Collins could barely breathe and could no longer stand. Ethan stopped Turner. Read that again. Turner did. I could have followed Rebecca. The weather may have allowed me through. Peter could not travel. I chose to remain with him because no man should wait for death, wondering whether everyone decided he was too difficult to carry. Ethan looked away. The rain had softened. Bruno lay beside Maya beneath a thermal blanket, eyes half closed. Turner continued. Hayes had hidden the journal and marked routes from the aircraft so that someone might reconstruct what happened if rescue arrived too late. The final paragraph was written less steadily than the rest. Turner read silently at first. Then Ethan said, out loud. The sheriff looked at him. Ethan nodded. Turner read, we cannot answer forever for the people we couldn't save. We answer for the ones we still have a choice not to abandon. Nobody spoke. The sentence seemed to remain in the wet mountain air after Turner's voice ended. Ethan stared at Bruno. Afghanistan returned. Not as an explosion. Not rotor wash. Not shouting. Just two men beside a damaged aircraft. The image that had followed him into motel rooms, parking lots, and sleepless nights. For years, he'd kept trying to change one moment that was already finished, as if enough punishment could somehow reach backward. Bruno shifted beneath the blanket. Ethan moved beside him. The shepherd's eyes opened. I'm here, Ethan whispered. This time his hands weren't shaking. Bruno pressed his nose weakly against Ethan's wrist. Ethan bowed his head until his forehead rested against the dog's. Behind them, Grant Shaw sat on a rock with his injured leg wrapped by a rescuer. He had heard the letter too. His face had gone pale. Turner looked toward him. Mr. Shaw. Grant didn't answer. His eyes remained on the documents, then on the remains of his father's leather strap. Ethan raised his head. One question still didn't fit. Grant had spent years searching for records that now appeared to prove Nathan had lied. He had searched Ethan's truck, followed him into the ravine, risked his life trying to recover the case. But if Grant truly knew what these papers contained, destroying them would have been simpler years ago. Ethan looked across the shelter at him. You didn't know, did you? Grant slowly lifted his eyes. Ethan understood before the man answered. Grant hadn't been protecting the truth. He had been protecting the story his father left him. Grant lowered his eyes. For a long moment, only the rescue radios spoke. Maya adjusted the blanket around Bruno, while one of the rescuers prepared the stretcher for the trip out. Sheriff Turner stood over the open document case, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat. Finally, Grant spoke. My father wrote to me. Ethan waited. Before the flight. During the weeks leading up to it. He said Rebecca Lane had stolen company documents. He said people were trying to destroy everything he'd built. Grant rubbed both hands over his face. After the plane disappeared, more letters surfaced. Copies he'd left with attorneys. Instructions. Names of people I wasn't supposed to trust. Turner asked, including Samuel Hayes? Grant nodded. And Rebecca Lane. What did your father say about the beacon? Nothing. Grant looked toward the flooded ravine. I didn't know. The words sounded smaller than Ethan expected. Grant had spent 18 years defending a man who was no longer there to answer questions. Every lawsuit, Every accusation, every newspaper article had pushed him deeper into the version Nathan left behind. My father said the documents would prove he was innocent, Grant continued. I believed him. So you kept looking, Ethan said, for 18 years. And when I found the jet, I thought you'd found what he wanted recovered. Grant's mouth tightened. I searched your truck. Turner looked at him. We'll discuss that later. Grant nodded without arguing. I followed Ethan because I thought Hayes had hidden the records. I thought if I got them first, I could finally clear my father's name. He looked at the open case. Instead, he carried the evidence against himself. Nobody offered Grant comfort. Nobody needed to. Some truths arrived too late to be gentle. Bruno made a soft sound. Ethan immediately turned. Maya checked the dog's bandage. He's okay. Just uncomfortable. Ethan crouched beside him. Bruno's nose touched his hand. You're getting soft, Ethan whispered. Bruno closed his eyes. The rescue team carried him out before sunset. Ethan walked beside the stretcher almost the entire way. At the temporary command post, a veterinarian from Salmon met them and examined Bruno before transporting him down the mountain. The diagnosis was better than Ethan feared. A deep flank laceration, severe bruising, a torn paw pad, a badly strained hind leg, but no major fracture. Rest. Stitches. Antibiotics. Time. Ethan sat on the floor beside Bruno's kennel at the veterinary clinic until sunrise. When he woke, his boots were still on, but his hand rested against Bruno's cage. The story of North Star 217 did not end on the mountain. Investigators recovered the wreck and Nathan Shaw's remains after the weather cleared. The documents in the case were compared with county archives, company files, old land transactions, and Rebecca Lane's survey work. Enough matched. Families who had spent years believing they were foolish for selling land too cheaply learned that some of the information used to pressure them had been misleading. Not every accusation was proven. Not every old wrong could be repaired. But names were restored to the record. Dates were corrected. Deeds were examined. And the people aboard North Star 217 were no longer simply 4 names attached to a missing airplane. Search teams eventually found evidence that Rebecca Lane had made it several miles from the wreck before dying from exposure after another storm moved through the range. Peter Collins's remains were recovered near a sheltered area not far from the aircraft. Samuel Hayes was beside him. He had stayed. Grant Shaw returned to Turner's office 3 weeks later carrying 4 storage boxes, company correspondence, old legal files, copies of his father's letters. He surrendered them voluntarily. Ethan heard about it from Turner. Why? Ethan asked. The sheriff shrugged. Maybe being saved by a man you threatened changes your afternoon. Ethan looked toward Bruno, asleep on a blanket with his hind leg wrapped. Maybe. Grant never became Ethan's friend. The story didn't need that. Sometimes accountability was enough. Winter settled over Idaho. Ethan finished repairing the Granite Ridge generator. Turner paid him for 3 days. Ethan tried to argue that he'd spent most of those 3 days doing everything except repairing it. Turner paid him anyway. Then he offered something else. You ever consider search and rescue? Ethan laughed. No. I'm serious. I'm 44, Wade. Congratulations. You can count. I've got a bad knee. So does half the team. Ethan looked at Bruno. The shepherd was still recovering, though he had begun putting weight on the injured leg. Turner continued. You know aircraft, engines, navigation. You don't panic easily. Ethan gave him a look. Turner corrected himself. You panic usefully. That almost earned a smile. The county needs volunteers who know mountains and machines. Think about it. Ethan did. For the first time in years, thinking about next month didn't feel like staring at an empty road. By spring, he had rented a small cabin outside Salmon. Nothing impressive. One bedroom, a wood stove, a porch facing the mountains. The roof leaked beside the chimney until Ethan repaired it himself. Bruno claimed the rug beside the stove. Ethan bought a second-hand table and 2 chairs even though he lived alone. Maya noticed. Expecting company? Chair came with the table. Sure. Some nights were still bad. A truck would backfire on the highway. A helicopter would cross the valley. Ethan would wake with his pulse racing and his hand searching beside the bed. The memories didn't vanish because a letter told him to forgive himself. Healing wasn't that clean. But something changed. His boots still sat beside the bed. Some mornings Ethan woke and realized they hadn't moved all night. Months after Bruno's injury, the call came just before dawn. Missing hiker. Late season snow. Last known position near a ridge north of the river. Ethan pulled on his jacket. Bruno was already at the door. You sure? The shepherd stared at him. A pale scar showed beneath the fur along his flank. Ethan clipped on the search harness. All right. They joined the team at first light. Snow covered the ridge in a thin white sheet. The mountains stretched around them, beautiful and indifferent. Ethan moved with the search line until Bruno suddenly stopped. His body changed. Head lifted. Nose into the wind. For an instant, Ethan's shoulders tightened. His eyes checked the tree line. High ground. Low ground. Escape route. The old reflex remained. Maybe it always would. Then Bruno's tail moved once. Ethan rested a hand over the scar beneath the dog's fur. He remembered a lost jet beneath the pines, a beacon battery beside a dead man. Samuel Hayes choosing to stay with someone who couldn't walk, and a German shepherd disappearing into floodwater because loyalty had never been something Bruno knew how to do halfway. Ethan looked into the snowy timber. All right, partner. Bruno leaned forward. Show me. The shepherd moved. Ethan followed. Not because he believed the past had disappeared. Not because every debt had been paid or every memory had become painless. He followed because somewhere beyond those trees, somebody might be cold. Somebody might be injured. Somebody might be waiting for footsteps that hadn't arrived yet. For years, Ethan Cole had believed his life was defined by the people he hadn't been able to bring home. Bruno had taught him something harder. You could remember the lost without joining them. You could carry guilt without letting it choose every road. And sometimes the only answer to a moment when you couldn't stay was to recognize the next moment when you could. Bruno disappeared briefly between the pines, then barked. Once, clear and sharp. Ethan quickened his pace. I'm coming. His boots broke fresh tracks through the snow. Behind him, the mountain held the past. Ahead of him, someone was still waiting. And this time, Ethan stayed. If you believe loyalty means never leaving someone behind, comment 1 below. If Bruno was the heart of this story for you, comment 0. I'd love to see how many of you stayed with Ethan and Bruno all the way to the end. And if stories about veterans, loyal dogs, hidden truths, and second chances mean something to you, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next journey. There are still forgotten roads to follow, mysteries waiting in the mountains, and faithful dogs ready to lead the way. Until the next story, take care of yourself, take care of those who stay beside you, and never underestimate where one loyal companion might lead you.